My name is Thomas Reyes, and I buried my wife on a Tuesday morning in October, and by that same afternoon her CEO was calling my phone so many times I finally answered just to make it stop. My wife, Vivian, had worked as a senior operations director at a mid-size logistics company for 6 years, the kind of job she rarely discussed at length, mostly because I never asked the right questions. She died suddenly, an aneurysm, no warning, gone on a Thursday and buried the following Tuesday, the way you move through grief on autopilot when there are caskets to choose and relatives to host and a 14-year-old daughter who needs someone steady standing next to her at a graveside. I remember standing at the burial in a black suit that suddenly felt too big, my daughter Ruth's hand in mine, half listening to the priest, when my phone buzzed in my pocket for the third time in 20 minutes. I ignored it through the service. I ignored it through the reception. By 6 that evening, when it rang for what must have been the 8th time, I finally stepped outside and answered, mostly out of exhaustion. "Mr. Reyes," the voice said, "this is Colin Bragg, I'm the CEO at Halden Logistics, Vivian's company. I'm so sorry for your loss, truly. I wouldn't be calling today of all days if it weren't important. You need to see something." I told him, with as much patience as I had left in me that day, that whatever it was could wait. He said, gently but firmly, that it couldn't, not really, and that he'd rather I hear it from him directly than stumble onto it some other way. He told me Vivian had come to him 11 days before she died. Not about a raise, not about a transfer. She'd come to report irregularities she'd found in the company's shipping manifests, discrepancies that traced back to a senior VP quietly rerouting portions of client shipments through a shell logistics firm he personally owned, skimming margin off nearly 2 years of contracts. Vivian had spent weeks building the documentation quietly, methodically, the way she did everything, and she'd handed Colin a full file 11 days before her aneurysm, along with a note asking that it be handled carefully because she suspected the VP in question wasn't operating alone. I stood in my dark backyard holding the phone, Ruth's laughter drifting faintly from inside the house where relatives were still gathered, and I felt something shift that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the sudden understanding that my wife had spent the final weeks of her life carrying something heavy that she'd never once mentioned to me. "Why are you telling me this today?" I asked. He said because the VP in question had gotten word that Vivian's file existed, and had spent the 2 days since her death trying to quietly access her old work laptop and cloud files, framed to HR as simple offboarding procedure. Colin had blocked it, but barely, and he needed my permission, as her next of kin, to formally transfer her files and findings to the company's legal team before anything else disappeared. I want to be honest. Part of me wanted to tell him this wasn't my job, not today, not this week, that I had a daughter inside who needed her father more than a logistics company needed its books balanced. But another part of me, the part that had watched Vivian quietly carry things her whole life without ever asking for help, understood that this was the last thing she'd been working on, and that finishing it properly was the only thing I could still do for her. I gave him permission. I asked him to send everything he could to my own email as well, unofficially, because I wanted to understand exactly what my wife had uncovered before I let anyone else control the narrative around it. What I read over the following days was more extensive than Colin had let on. Vivian hadn't just found one VP skimming shipments. She'd found a pattern going back nearly 3 years, touching 4 separate accounts, funneling money that should have gone to client rebates into accounts controlled by 2 executives, one of whom had sat 2 seats down from me at a company holiday party 8 months earlier, smiling, asking about Ruth's soccer season. I hired an attorney of my own, not to sue anyone, but to make sure Vivian's name and findings were protected, that whatever credit or consequence came from this didn't quietly get buried alongside her. Colin, to his credit, moved fast once he had legal clearance. The VP was terminated within the week. An internal investigation, then an external audit, uncovered enough to trigger a formal case with the company's outside counsel, and eventually a settlement with the affected clients that ran into 7 figures. 6 weeks after the burial, Colin called again, this time with less urgency in his voice and something closer to solemn respect. He told me the board wanted to establish a scholarship in Vivian's name at the local university, Logistics and Supply Chain Management, specifically for students who couldn't otherwise afford the program. He asked if Ruth would like to be there when they announced it. I stood in that same backyard when he asked, and I thought about my wife carrying a file full of other people's dishonesty quietly in her bag for 11 days, never once mentioning it at our dinner table, protecting me and Ruth from a burden that wasn't ours to carry until it absolutely had to be. I told him yes. Ruth stood on a small stage 4 months later while a university dean spoke about integrity and quiet courage, and I sat in the audience thinking that my wife had spent her final weeks doing the hardest, most honest work of her career, entirely without an audience, entirely without expecting anyone to notice. I don't know if Vivian ever imagined her name attached to a scholarship, or a company scandal, or a call that reached her husband on the day of her burial. I only know that the woman I buried that Tuesday morning had been quietly protecting people who never knew her name until after she was gone, and that the least I could do, the very least, was make sure her name stayed exactly where she'd earned it.